Okay, today you're going to be looking at the dynamics of intelligence. And just to go back over that normal bell curve here, we have on the gifted side anybody with an IQ that is 2 or more standard deviations. That's an IQ of over 130. We would consider gifted. It's about 2% of our population. And on the other end, you can see that somebody who's labeled with an intellectual disability would be in the bottom 2% of the population. Would label somebody as intellectually disabled. Those are people that have low extremes of intelligence, those IQs below 70. It's not enough to test as IQ below 70. There have to be some comparable limitations and some kind of behavior that allows them to live their daily life, like they have a hard time with handling their own money or keeping time so they don't make it to appointments. They have difficulty socializing with others. They don't always take care of themselves, and they don't schedule their own doctor's appointments. So these are like language, social, and practical skills. So it's not enough to have an IQ that's testable under 70. You also have to have limitations in other behavior. So when we look at the gifted side of it, there's always been sort of this debate. Do we track gifted students? Do we, in other words, separate gifted students from others and put them into their own classroom, as you might a classroom with kids who are intellectually disabled? And if you do that, the problem with that is what we call that self-fulfilling prophecy. People who don't get into a gifted classroom may be implicitly labeled ungifted, and then they just fulfill that prophecy. They're like, well, I'm not really that smart, so why should I try really hard? Something's hard for me. Well, I'm not that smart, so there's no reason for me to keep trying. We know it also increases social isolation, and it promotes segregation and prejudice because minority and low-income youth are much more likely to be placed in those lower academic groups. Just pausing here to give you some time to take some notes. So, to what extent is nature and nurture, what does that play into your individual intelligence? And we know that intelligence, the heritability of it is high. And when I say the word heritability, this is an important definition, not just to write down, but to understand. A lot of people look at that word and I think it's inherited. Well, it's not. Inheritability is really about the difference among us that it can attribute to genes. So what percent, let's say, of the difference among our eye colors can we attribute to genes? And the answer is probably 100%. But to what extent is the heritability of intelligence? In other words, the variation of our IQs in this room, to what extent do we attribute to our genes? So heritability is one of those concepts where, again, you're looking at variations in the population and trying to figure out are they due to genes or not. Here we're going to take a look at the Rosenzweig study, and we know that, I said this I think yesterday, early childhood education and your early childhood experiences are really important to your brain developing strong synaptic connections. In a study that was done in Rosenzweig, what we find is that unused synaptic connections in childhood, in this case the childhood of rats, get pruned away. And synaptic pruning it happens in a much greater extent in impoverished brains. So let's take a look at the study.
Alrighty, so the study that we're going to look at is the Rosenzweig study, Rosenzweig et al., which was done in 1972, which is going to help us answer the learning outcome about how our environment can affect our physiology. Okay? And so basically the environment we're looking at is the environment in which the rats live, and the physiology is their brain size and how complicated their brain is. So basically the theoretical proposition or the hypothesis was that animals raised, actually I'll highlight that, animals raised in highly stimulating environments will demonstrate differences in brain growth and chemistry when compared with animals reared in plain or dull circumstances. So basically what we had was 12 sets of 3 male rats from the same litter. So what they had was there was one litter, and they'd take 3 male rats from that same litter. They'd put one of them in a control setting. They'd put one of them in an impoverished or poor or boring or dull setting, and then they'd put one in an enriched, really fun, exciting setting with lots of stimulation. And so obviously you see in the control group, they were put in with several other rats in a normal sized cage, several other rats of their own litter, and given sufficient food and water. In the impoverished setting, the poor setting, the boring setting, it was one poor little rat all by itself in a small cage with also sufficient food and water. And then the third sibling from those 3 male rats was put into an enriched cage, which was like a rat Disneyland, hence the Mickey Mouse, with all kinds of fun games to do, the running wheel and all kinds of things, and a few other friends to hang out with, also given sufficient food and water. They did this with 12 different sets of the male rats. Next, got 3 different conditions. Those 3 conditions were tested 16 different times for 4 to 10 weeks each, without the researchers knowing which mice they were examining in the end. So this would avoid researcher bias or expectations by the researchers or confirmation bias. The results show that the cerebral cortexes, which is the outside section of the brain that is responsible for responding to experiences, movement, memory, learning, and sensory input. So any, sights and sounds and tastes, that part was thicker and heavier in the enriched rats, okay? Also, increased activity of an enzyme acetylcholinesterase, which we can associate with memory a little bit, so increased activity of this memory enzyme. There were larger neurons, okay? There weren't more neurons, but there were larger neurons, which are the brain cells. It's my lovely picture of neurons. And a greater RNA to DNA ratio, which is actually really important for cell growth. Okay, and then the last result was that the synapses, remember that place where 2 neurons meet each other, if we zoom right in, those were 50% larger. So if you can imagine, if the synapse is larger, the space where that chemical electrical transaction happens, if that's larger, more neurotransmitters can be transmitted, more action can take place. To the results, these are the effects of the environment on an impoverished versus enriched environment, right? On the physiology of the mice's brains. Okay, so thicker and heavier cerebral cortexes, increased activity of acetylcholinesterase, larger neurons, greater RNA to DNA ratio, and 50% larger synapses. Okay, so that is real results. The learning outcome is discussing the role that the environment can play on physiology. So some discussion points. Was the rats' handling different when the toys were changed? So were the rats handled more in the enriched environment? Maybe just the fact that they were given skin love by experimenters' hands, that might have been enough to enrich their brains, but that later became unimportant because they resampled it, holding them all the same amount, and there was no difference. Were the impoverished rats stressed by being all alone, which could have affected their brain structure? Once again, the answer is no. They looked at other stressed brains of rats, and there was no difference in those brains. And those rats had received like electrical shocks and stuff. One other question, do wild rats have even more developed brains than the enriched lab rats? And the answer is yes. So none of these lab conditions can substitute for a real life situation, which is something to think about. Can we generalize any of this to humans? Well, we'll get to that in a minute. And lastly, in a recent study, maybe in the last 10, 15 years or so, Olson et al. Actually tried to isolate not just the enriched environment, but the role of the exercise wheel in the cage. Was it the exercise wheel or was it the enriched environment in general? And what Olson found was that the exercise wheel was actually the more significant factor in the whole enriched cage that affected the brains of the enriched rats. So quite interesting, is it the enriched environment or the exercise? And there is some research out there, according to Olson, that says that the exercise is more important. Going back real quick. Lastly, the real life application. Why does this matter? Who cares? Well, we can, use this information to help study how we can improve memory and how we can prevent memory loss in old age. We can also research the effects of malnutrition on intelligence. Malnutrition being, a sign of an impoverished environment and how it affects our intelligence. Some human evidence to support this animal research would be that human brains that have been examined, that of people who died naturally, show that the more skills and abilities a person had when they were alive, the more complex and heavy their cortex was. So, if you think about people who played instruments and were really active and were able to, taught themselves lots of things, their brains were heavier and more complex. And lastly, examinations of blind people's brains show thinner, simpler, and less developed cortexes in the visual regions of their cortex. So once again, if they weren't getting visual stimulation because they were blind, those parts of their cortex were smaller and thinner and less developed. Okay, so that's some human research to back it up. And that, my friends, is how we answer the learning outcome for the effect of environment on physiology. Just going.
Okay. Let me stop the video here. Okay, so this study was
Alrighty,
really
so the study that we're going to look.
This study was a really important study because it does say experience matters, and we know that when we look at IQs of children that come from less rich or less enriched environments, their IQs tend to suffer at younger ages, but once they make it through high school and maybe through college, their IQs do improve dramatically because they are still able to make use of the connections that they have. Okay, you're going to be doing a .P activity on stereotype threat. Stereotype threat is the anxiety that a person might feel when they're put into a position where they could confirm some negative aspect of whatever a membership group that they belong to. Like, for example, the study you're going to be looking at are about women and math, and women have this, there's a stereotype that men are better than women at math. And when women are put into a position where they feel like they might confirm that negative stereotype, the anxiety that they feel, could actually impair their performance on math skills tests. And I'll let you do that .P activity and learn a little bit about that from Claude Steele. Dr. Steele's study, again, I wanted to go over the operational definition, but I think I'll wait till we come back together and we'll review these slides. So one of the things that we do know about people's ability to try and at least demonstrate their intelligence is that if they feel that nothing they do can actually make a difference, that they can't escape a bad situation no matter what, they learn to be helpless. So learned helplessness was studied by Dr. Seligman, and he found when he put dogs on a shock grid, as you see here, and he prevented them from being able to leave the shock grid. And you can see in this picture that the dog can actually leave the shocking side of the grid. So, but he actually raised that barrier so that the dog could not escape. After a while, even though if you put the barrier down, the dog wouldn't even try to escape. They learned that no matter what, they could not possibly escape the situation. So even when given the opportunity, they didn't even try. So we know that people behave the same way, and that they tend to overlook opportunities to relieve themselves of some burden and to change a bad situation. And we know it plays a huge role, and we'll revisit this in our disorders and treatment unit. It plays a huge role in depression. So is there a difference between gender, in this case, really should be sex, and intelligence? It's an old slide. So females tend to be better at spelling and locating objects, detecting emotions. They're more verbally fluent, more sensitive to touch, taste, and color. So they have lower difference thresholds and lower absolute thresholds for those. Now, men tend to be better when handling spatial reasoning or complex math problems, and better at things like mentally rotating a three-dimensional object, like using that working memory to do it. So These differences, though, are they due to socialization, um, or are they due to actual differences in the brains of males and females? Which, of course, the brains are different among sexes. So, if we look at, let's say, what a female might excel in terms of a part of an intelligence test, it would be, for example, rearranging the following letters to make the word and choose a category in which it fits. And I'll let you try doing that. And then also, men or boys would be better at just determining which of these cubes here represents a cube that could be made from this particular set of colors. So I can't remember if I have the answer in here, but parakeet, by the way, was the answer, and it will let you take a look at the that cube on your own. So, what do we know about aging and intelligence? We know that intelligence does remain stable over time unless you were born into an impoverished environment and later or subsequently had a higher education. That we know that because we've done longitudinal testing on cohorts, the same group of people over time. Now, it doesn't matter that older adults give fewer correct answers than younger adults on intelligence tests because remember, you are comparing the raw score on an IQ test of a 70-year-old to other 70-year-olds. So all adults will likely display some decrease in intelligence, but relative to their cohort, their intelligence will be stable. In other words, their IQ will remain stable over time. Again, relative to their age cohort. In a study that was done, I think this was done in Scotland, they took a look at, on the y-axis here, you see the IQ at the age of 80, and on the x-axis, an IQ at the age of 11. Now, of course, some people dropped out of the study. Not everybody made it to age 80, but you can see there's a pretty strong positive correlation, again, especially as you move to the upper regions here. So this is depicting a strong positive correlation between intelligence when comparing the intelligence of somebody at age 11 to when they are at age 80. Now remember, over time, crystallized intelligence, that's the accumulation of the knowledge, the facts, and the skills, continues to increase. As long as your hippocampus is intact, you can create new long-term explicit memories. Fluid intelligence, that's the ability to reason and to think flexibly and quickly, decreases with age, and that's, of course, due to the shrinkage of connections in the prefrontal cortex. That's a little bit of review. Okay, so those are the dynamics of intelligence. We still will go through some of these slides when I return. I would say that for the rest of this period, I would ask that you work on the assignment that's due next week, or you can certainly do one of the .p activities. And that's basically it. Have a great weekend, and I will see you on Monday.